Só um minutinho. Nossa sala está chegando no YouTube, batendo a porta. Em 3, 2, 1, transmitindo. Pode começar.
So, good evening to you all. I'd like to welcome you to the third Translation and Interpretation Symposium, SIMTRADI, organized by UFSC, the Federal University of Goiás. And we're very happy to have Professor Dr. Danielle Hunt here with us today. So first of all, thank you, Dr. Danielle, for being here, for having accepted the invitation to give what we know will be a lovely talk for everyone who's watching today. I'd also like to thank the interpreters, Paulo, which is interpreting from English into Portuguese, and Quintino, our sign language interpreters. So thank you both for also being here today. I'm going to talk a little bit now about who Dr. Danielle Hunt is. So she is currently assistant professor in the Department of Interpretation and Translation, and currently serves as the PhD in Interpretation Program Coordinator. She has been a faculty member in the Department of Interpretation and Translation since 2013. So her area of expertise includes professional identity development of American Sign Language English interpreters. She also holds the NAD-RIB National Interpreter Certification Advanced, NICA, and Board for Evaluation of Interpreters Certificate, Master's B Master. So Dr. Hunt, she has been working as a professional American Sign Language English interpreter since 2000, and her specialty in the field is performing arts interpreting. Wow, that is amazing. So she founded Bay Area Communication, Sign Language Interpreting Agency in 2001, expanding her private practice to include several other interpreters. So Dr. Hunt first came to Gallaudet as a visiting student in the fall of 2000. And upon completion of her BA degree in sociology from Texas A&M Corpus Christi, she returned to Kendall Green as a graduate student in the MA in Interpretation program. Upon graduation in 2006, she stayed in the DC area as a staff interpreter with Sign Language Associates. She joined Gallaudet Interpreting Service as a staff interpreter in 2009. So in the next year, 2010, she entered the inaugural class of the Department of Interpretation's PhD in Interpretation program and graduated with her doctorate in 2015. And her doctoral dissertation, which will be the topic of her talk today, is The Work Is You, Professional Identity Development of Second Language Learner, American Sign Language English Interpreters, and is currently forthcoming with Gallaudet University Press. So she has also served as a manuscript reviewer for the Registry of Interpreter Press and as an ad hoc reviewer for the Journal of Undergraduate Interpreting Studies. Also, Dr. Hunt has worked as co-editor in the 2014 Conference of Interpreter Trainers Proceedings. And also, Dr. Hunt has presented at numerous conferences, both nationally and internationally. And it's such a pleasure to have you here with us today, Dr. Hunt. So we're very glad to hear what you have to say to us today. And expectations are very high, and I'm pretty sure we're going to learn a lot. So you can start with your talk.
Thank you so much, Hannah, for that introduction. I really appreciate it. I also want to thank all of you for the opportunity to present my research today. As you mentioned, I'll be focusing on my dissertation study. I'm very excited to share that with you, but before I jump into that, I want to begin with an Indigenous land acknowledgement to recognize and honor the history and people of the places around us. So I am joining today's session from Gallaudet University. I'm here in my office in what is colonially known as Washington, D.C. in the United States. This is unceded, stolen land, and I want to respectfully acknowledge the Nacochek and Piscataway people, who were also known as the Anacostan people, who have stewarded the land throughout the generations and continue to do so. So it is with great respect that I look to the elders, both past and present. So thank you. Any research in inquiry begins with the known experience. So you have to understand factors that are influencing incidents that shape our lives. At the heart of research lies a search for understanding something about which a researcher cares about. So I care about my friends who are deaf, I care about my friends who are interpreters, and I care about communication access. That is why I did this study, because I wanted to learn more about how American Sign Language English interpreters made sense of and understood interpreting work. So I decided to focus on the lived experience of people who are similar to me. So to begin, I myself am a white, able-bodied, non-deaf, straight, cisgender female belonging to the upper middle class in the United States. I now work as an interpreter, researcher, and educator here at Gallaudet University, which is the only liberal arts college in the world that focuses on educating deaf and hard of hearing students. I am an academically trained, nationally certified community interpreter as well. I first learned ASL in high school when I took it as my foreign language. So with this study, I am focusing on the interpreter as a person possessing a professional identity, which has been successfully integrated into the work that she does, rather than just another participant in an interpreted interaction. Identity itself answers the questions of who do I think I am, who do I say I am, and who do others think I am? So this topic is particularly relevant because it draws on the human element of community interpreters by focusing on their experiences. So with that, I'll move on to the next slide. Next slide. That was right. So I'd like to begin with a little bit of history about interpreting in the United States, just because it's slightly different, I'm sure, than what is happening in Brazil and in other countries. So sign language interpreting in the US is still considered a new field. It was established as a paid profession here in the 1960s. Part of the work of interpreting has caused community interpreters to be taught to hide their identities as part of their work, because professional interpreters have to remain neutral and not take sides. However, if we think about identity, constructionist principles really place identity as a phenomenon that is socially and jointly constructed during interactions. So this means as we go through different interactions with people, we are constantly developing and changing our identities. So for interpreters, these identities shift with each interaction. Current research in translation and interpreting studies focuses on the process of interpreting, the product of an interpretation, and the role of the interpreter in an interpreted interaction. These are areas that are commonly researched in the field. However, my study does not address any of these things. It looks at the interpreter as a person and the complexities that make up that person. So when talking about interpreters and translators, one interpreter researcher, Pim, has said that interpreters are people with flesh and blood bodies. If you prick them, they bleed. So again, we are not machines. We are not just language processors, but we are human beings. And so that's what I really wanted to get to with this study. I know this picture is a little hard to see, so I'm going to explain a bit of what it is. This is actually a poster that was in Gallaudet University's Student Center in 2014, I would say. And it was an art exhibit that just showed an opportunity to express who you were. So there were sticky notes, little Post-its like this here, and you would write your identity, whatever that was, and then place it on the poster. And as I was walking down the hallway, I noticed that there was one post-it note, one note that said an interpreter. And that's really what got me started on this journey, figuring out what the identity of an interpreter was. And I really wanted to focus on the professional side of the interpreter, as opposed to just who the interpreter is as a person. So it's a combination of both. So as people, our identities come to the fore in our interactions, as I said. So the human element of the interpreter is probably the most critical aspect of the work of interpreting, which means we have to really pay attention to who interpreters are. This is why I'm studying identity, because the performance of identity allows for us to change who we are ourselves. We develop identity through variation on repetition. So the more we are in a situation, the more we are around people, we build an identity. And that identity can become global. So studying identity provides a focus on the interpreter, again, as a person, having a professional identity based in the work that she does. So even though we are often taught that we have to divorce ourselves from our professional identity, I suggest that we embrace it and allow it to become part of who we are as we are working. So I'm going to start with the statement of the problem. So if someone asked you, who are you? How would you respond? What would your identity be? Of course, it depends on who you're around and when you are asked. There was an interview conducted in 1989 by a group of sign language interpreters here in the US. And one particular interpreter stated when answering this question, I guess part of me is advocate and part of me is interpreter, besides my own person. I think I'm divided into several people. So piecing together these shards of self leads to identities that we present to the world. It's important to note that most sign language interpreters in the United States are actually learning American Sign Language as a second language. So that's what I mean here by second language users. Can you go back? Thanks. Go back. All right, so the main goal then of the study is to understand how interpreters react to norms in the field and how they identify themselves as they move through the field. You'll notice the last bullet point here talks about a developed identity. Researchers like Butler have said that identities evolve over time, but there has to be a stable existence or one base identity that is constructed prior to taking on other identities. So it's important that we understand who we are as people sort of first before we can even think about professional identity. Another researcher, Hall, however, has said that identity is always in process. So it is always changing and always fluctuating. So I'll go ahead and share my research question. So my study addressed the question, how does a group of second language learner, American Sign Language English interpreters experience the development of a professional identity? This meant that I had to investigate how the interpreter identity develops and how it changes over time. One important point here is the idea of professional identity. So that being different than a personal one. So I will share my definition of what a professional identity is. I used an interdisciplinary approach to create the definition of professional identity using 3 themes that researchers Gibson, Dollaride, and Moss actually identified as being very important to professional identity. Those 3 were self-labeling as a professional, integration of skills and attitudes as a professional, and a perception of context in a professional community. So that led me to develop the definition that I will show on the next slide. So here's the definition that I used for my study. A professional identity is a person's developed self-concept based in attitudes, beliefs, values, norms, and attributes as part of the professional roles and responsibilities of a given occupation or field. Again, this looks at social, political, and institutional levels as they come into contact, meaning that professional identity is only one part of the many intersectional identities that develop and change over time. So I'd like to share with you my stance, my analytical stance, which informed the methodology, how I came up with the study. First of all, this is a qualitative methods study where I looked at the whole person's experience through language. So people had to share their experiences with me through storytelling and narratives. As people recount their experiences, they make meaning and interpret that meaning, which results in an interpretation of an interpretation. So it creates a cycle of understanding. And this is the basis for my study, which is phenomenology. Basically, phenomenology is the study of experiences with the research goal of finding meaning of a particular phenomenon through the lived experience of another from their own point of view. I then, as the researcher, have to gather their experiences and then interpret them, not just define them or present them. Next, I'll share what the study actually did, how I collected data. So again, my methodology was actually called a hermeneutical phenomenology. To start and find participants, I initially sent out a questionnaire. I asked for demographic information, questions in general about identity and labels that people used, and I asked if people would be interested in participating further. I had 100 interpreters from all over the United States respond to that questionnaire. Based on who could actually participate and who wanted to continue, I ended up with 7 interpreters who were the primary study participants. These are those 7 interpreters. I'll give you a moment to look at the slide. You'll notice at the top that I use the term co-researcher. This comes from other phenomenologists, specifically von Eckertsburg and Moustakis. In their research, they used this term co-researcher rather than participant. because really the evidence for the study comes from their life experiences. So they are co-constructing the data and interpreting the data with me. So this story that I am sharing with you is not mine, it is theirs. All of these participants identified as hearing or non-deaf white women between the ages of 30 and 50. All had learned American Sign Language as a second language, and all had acquired ASL in their teens or 20s. All have at least a BA degree, a bachelor's degree, and have varied years of experience, you can see. They are all also nationally certified by the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf, which provides certification here in the US. It is important to note that RID really reproduces hearingness, whiteness, and femaleness through their maintenance and recruitment of their membership. In 2018, members self-reported as being 96% hearing, 87% white, and 87% female. That means that the group here is actually very representative of what our field looks like in the United States. It's also important to note that because these women are all non-deaf, they're white, they're educated, and they are certified professionals, they have been able to move throughout their careers in ways that others cannot, also in their everyday lives. Now I'd like to share with you how I collected data and show you some of the data that I did collect. First, I asked these 7 interpreters to engage in what is called auto photography, which isn't necessarily taking a selfie, but it just means a person taking a picture. So they were to take 5 photographs, each of which was a response to the question, who are you? So the resulting photographs were then used to guide an interview that was 1 hour in length, where participants talked about the photos and how they related to their identities specifically. All seven interpreters had at least 1 photograph out of those 5 that represented an affiliation with deaf community members or in their work as interpreters. So I'd like to actually show you what some of their photographs were so that you can see as well. So these were the photos that particularly represented either a connection to deaf people or to their work as interpreters. Some are obvious and some are not. And so I collected the stories behind each of those photos. In addition to collecting those stories, and after the interview, the photo elicitation interview, I scheduled a series of 3 phenomenological interviews with each of the co-researchers. So this 3-interview series followed Seidman's 2013 approach. So each interview was 90 minutes long, and they focused on identity as related to the past, the present, and then a reflection on both of those things, as well as the future. Those interviews resulted in about 1,200 pages of transcripts, which I then read and reread and read some more and thought about a lot in coming up with themes. When I analyzed the data, I developed 3 superordinate or overarching themes. I actually want to show you a few quotes that characterize some of the themes that came up, and then I will go into each theme a bit more. So in this quote, one interpreter, Katie, shared, "I remember my brother saying, 'You're not deaf.' I just immersed myself by signing all the time, any chance I got." So for Katie, she took a leap that others in her life noticed. She was signing all the time. And this even made her brother question, "Why are you doing this?" It just became that much a part of her life. So Grace said, "I think you have to have an affiliation, an association, an alignment, an ally kind of relationship with the deaf community. So it's definitely a commitment you make when you choose to become an interpreter." So here in the United States, having a relationship with deaf communities is definitely required as part of the work of the interpreter. They are expected to maintain some level of relationship. This relationship leads to cultural competency and language fluency and allows us to work with members of these communities. As Grace pointed out, not only do you have to be culturally competent and linguistically competent, but you also have to become an ally to this particular marginalized language group. It's important that an interpreter recognizes and respects her place in an interaction, that she wouldn't be there were it not for deaf people. So Sydney states, "I would say being an interpreter to me means being at the crossroads where 2 cultures meet who use 2 different languages. And interpreting is to do our best to convey the content and feeling of each of these cultures' communications to the other." So this idea of a crossroads where 2 cultures and languages come together came up often. Almost every interpreter mentions this. This is similar to another researcher, Anzaldúa, who described this as a borderlands. Also, a researcher here in the US, deaf interpreter and scholar MJ Bienvenu, first talked about this in 1987 as a concept of a third culture, where not only do you have deaf culture and hearing culture come together, but you have an interpreter culture as well. And so interpreters fall into this space where they're not hearing and they're not deaf. They're something different. I'd like to share now how I actually analyzed the data. So I made use of what is called in vivo coding, which uses quotes from the co-researchers as codes. So I didn't have a code book or have themes in mind before I went into the interviews. I searched for emergent themes and found about 25 of them. I then grouped these into 9 sub-themes, and those 9 led to 3 superordinate themes. Again, the goal was to understand the lived experience of these co-researchers and to identify the essence of their experience with professional identity. Just a bit more about my analysis. One researcher, phenomenologist Van Manen, talks about how themes are like knots in the webs of our experiences, around which certain lived experiences are spun and thus lived through as meaningful wholes. I took this idea of knots in creating the levels of themes. So you'll see as I show the data, I use these colors, purple being threads or very detailed parts. Then green being an overall theme or a knot. And then the superordinate theme is presented in red. So I'd like to show you what those themes were. So the first superordinate theme is the work as an extension of self, meaning that the work is more than just what you do. It really becomes who you are. So there is a body of knowledge that is passed down from one generation of interpreters to the next generation. And they often go to one another to discuss the work as trusted colleagues. They form connections in both deaf and interpreting communities. And this all allows for an examination and a re-examination of themselves in relation to the work. So the next theme that emerged was the evolution of an interpreter self. Every interpreter discussed ways that they acquired the language, American Sign Language, and how they entered the field and became an interpreter. They all also mentioned the idea of learning to be a professional while constantly striving to get certification. They all mentioned in their interviews that they wanted to continue interpreting for as long as possible and would remain connected to deaf community members and the field, as well as to interpreters in some way, even beyond their time as an interpreter. So this really has changed them, moving from ASL students learning the language to novice interpreters working in the field to professional certified interpreters. And they all were able to trace this evolution. The final superordinate theme I'd like to discuss is the current professional identity of being and becoming. So being an interpreter is not just enough. It is the process of becoming, it is the evolution, but it's also an ongoing thing. We never quite get there. We're always striving to be more. Also, several of the co-researchers mentioned this idea of having two completely separate lives or worlds in their terms, but also noted that there are overlaps or merging of these two. So for example, in particular, Belle, Mariah, and Grace all said that for themselves and other interpreters, a lot of times their lives sort of blend together because deaf people are family or friends. And it's interesting because all of the interpreters also talked about interpreting or deaf community connections and the real world. So the real world was something that was separate. The real world was what they were before. So often when I would ask a question about identity, they would respond with, well, do you mean as an interpreter or do you mean in the real world? Which is very interesting to think about how interpreters were examining their own identities. So again, here you'll see the three superordinate themes and their relationship to professional identity. This is somewhat known as a hermeneutic circle. It's basically a cycle of making meaning. So you continue to have experiences, you reflect on these experiences, you arrive at and continuously grow new understandings of identity. So each theme, 1, 2, and 3, all influence professional identity. And that professional identity development then continues to impact all three of the superordinate themes. So it's a constant cycle. As I said before, many of the co-researchers talked about the idea of getting to a place or like becoming certified, and that was the kind of final thing. But it's not, right? Once you're certified, then you still have to work as a professional. So it's a constant moving forward. And it's important to note that as these interpreters declared themselves to be professional interpreters, they had earned certification. Other people saw them as interpreters, and they continually perform the role of being an interpreter. They position themselves as professional interpreters, and that has become their professional identity. I'd like to offer just a few thoughts on the implications for this research. So we have all these themes. I've collected all of these experiences. How can they help us in the ASL English interpreting field? First, interpreter education. Learners bring different identities into the classroom, and they create diverse and rich experiences in the learning environment. So these environments have to be inclusive of multicultural approaches to being, different knowledge bases, different perspectives and styles of learning. There's also similarities and differences in the experiences of these co-researchers, and their experiences can be guides for others coming into the field. Next, in workplace experiences, they all discussed their current lives as interpreters and what they experience every day on the job. So learning more about these particular experiences can help us recognize key issues that arise while working. In addition, there's the development of bonds within interpreter institutions. So these co-researchers all talked about the field of interpreting here in the US being supportive, having a network of colleagues, but also being unsupportive, sometimes on the individual level and on personal notes. So this type of knowledge can help us in figuring out how to create stronger bonds and how to encourage people to participate more in interpreter institutions in particular. Finally, by looking at the understanding and integration that these co-researchers went through as they joined deaf communities, we can learn more about how others can transition into the field and into deaf communities. How do we recruit new interpreters? How can we encourage new interpreters and make sure that they are integrated correctly, safely, and successfully? So again, I return back to this picture. This was actually my auto photography. So I took this picture, and again, it sparked my interest in this research on identity. Traditionally, the interpreter's role has been described using metaphors like a telephone line or a machine or even a bridge. And it helps to understand these descriptions, and these metaphors do help us in understanding the work, but they also kind of take the human part out of it. It pushes the work as being separate from who we are as people. And I have found through this study that it's important to add this human element back in. Grace, one of the co-researchers, stated during her interview, "You invest your life. I invest all of who I am in this. It's not just a job. It's not just a career." And for me, that really rang true. So for me, an interpreter is a whole person who functions as a whole professional rather than just her hands or her voice. So I'd like to wrap up tonight a bit with an activity called Closing the Circle. It's really just an opportunity for you to think yourselves about the following questions. First, what does identity mean to you? As an interpreter or a translator yourself, how do you identify? What is your professional identity? What does the work actually mean to you? I hope that you've been able to think a bit more about your own professional identity as an interpreter or translator today. So for me, the work is you, all of you. Also, the work is me. I am an ASL English interpreter myself. Ultimately, though, the work is us. And we have to build the work together as people with all of our messy identities, including our professional ones. Thank you for joining in on this discussion today. I'm happy to take any questions if we have time, Hanna.
Wow, what an amazing talk, honestly. Your questions, your final questions really made me think. We sometimes forget to see that we interpreters, we are human beings, and we have our own needs, and we have our own histories and our values, and we cannot simply exclude that from what we do. We deal with people in difficult situations. So us being humans, people can only benefit from our humanity, and we need to recognize that and accept that we're not machines. As you mentioned, that sometimes we use metaphors, that we are bridges, and we are we only mediate interactions, but we know that our role in society is way deeper than that. And your research is simply amazing and touched me, and I believe it touched everyone who is watching. We did not have any questions via chat, but I would like to know what led you to that topic. What conducted you? Why did you decide to write your dissertation on this topic?
That's actually a great question. And I think I'd like to share just a little bit about why I joined the PhD program in the first place, because I actually had originally thought it would just help my interpreting. I would learn more about interpreting, and that would help me be a better interpreter. So originally that was my goal. I just wanted to learn more about interpreting. And as I started taking classes and eventually got to teaching classes as part of my own time in the program, I started to realize how much research and teachers can influence the field. And as an interpreter educator now, I depend on research to really guide me. And knowing that we can really make a difference based on what we're reading or what we're thinking about or what kind of questions we're asking, that's what really led me down this path. I was sitting in a class and, we were talking about the metaphors of interpreting and how it's so separate from who we are as people. And I think that's kind of what led me to start thinking about, right, but I'm still a person and I bring something to the interaction. So for a long time, at least here in the US, like I said, interpreters are taught you have to be neutral. That is what a professional interpreter is. You don't take sides, you don't support the deaf person, you don't support the hearing person, completely neutral. That's impossible. It's impossible. So I really wanted to learn more about what we bring to the interaction, and that started with our identities. And because I couldn't focus on all of the identities, I chose just to focus on the professional one because I thought that would have the greatest impact on the experience of being an interpreter, is how you see yourself as an interpreter. And I'm actually, as you mentioned, I'm working on turning this dissertation into a book that's going to be published hopefully soon. And part of what I am hoping, and as I'm rereading the dissertation and editing it, is that these stories really come out as not only individual stories of these interpreters' experiences, but also stories that we can relate to as interpreters. I found myself sitting in the interviews going, yep, I had that same experience, or, oh, I know someone else that had that same thing happen to them. And so it helps in that feeling of not being alone. And I think that's a big part of it too.
Absolutely. As you mentioned, I think you wrote in your last slide, the work is us, because we depend on other people. We can't simply work alone. And another question, I suppose it's an obvious question, but do you think people have been rethinking or interpreters, sign language interpreters have been rethinking ourselves? We have been rethinking ourselves, especially during the pandemic, because we know it's a situation in which our personal lives and professional lives got all of a sudden mixed up, and working from home and all the different necessities and needs that we had during this pandemic. Do you think this was also a wake-up call to our own humanity as people, as professionals, as interpreters? How do you think the pandemic affected, or did it affect interpreters' view of themselves and of their work?
Definitely. And actually, I feel like you are reading my mind a bit, and it's kind of scary, because that's actually where my research is going now, is not so much with the pandemic, but I'm focusing more on the idea of trauma-informed practices. And it's also called culturally responsive pedagogy here in the US. And part of that is a result of the pandemic. So as an educator myself, seeing students show up in class who want to learn about interpreting or want to learn to be interpreter educators, and connecting via Zoom, and you can see into their bedrooms. You can see their dog run across the screen, or someone's cat sits right in front of them in the middle of class, or someone has to turn off their camera because they're embarrassed about something that's going on, or whatever it is. And these same things happen in the field to interpreters every day right now, because we are working from home, because we're working virtually, because we're connecting with people in new ways. And so I think that it has shifted even more and forced us to see ourselves as people. So that's part of being trauma-informed, is recognizing that things like a global pandemic are going to change the field in a way that can be good, and we need to leverage that. So right now we have new ways of using technology. I can present to you tonight from my office in DC in a way that I couldn't before. Perhaps I wouldn't be able to make it to Brazil for a presentation. So that's great, but it's also traumatic. Everything that we have gone through in the past year and a half, 2 years, has been a trauma. And it has changed who we are as people, fundamentally, and who we are as professionals. And so I think that that's kind of the next wave of research, is how do we leverage what we're learning now? How do we take a trauma-informed approach where we recognize that trauma is happening, that we are changing, and then how do we make the field better as a result?
Wow, I definitely look forward to reading your work on that. Expectations are very high again. Well, I would really like to thank you, Dr. Hunt, for being here today. We don't have any other questions via chat. But once again, thank you for your amazing talk. I'm absolutely sure that everyone, such as myself, have learned a lot, and we will definitely rethink our roles and try to break down these myths that we are machines, that we work based on a recipe or something like that. We are people that, and we have our needs. We work as a whole, and if we continue thinking like that, or if we start thinking like that, great things can come. So thank you, Dr. Danielle. Thank you, both interpreters, Paulo and Quintino. This is just the first day. Don't forget that this is just the first day of the third SIMTRADI. So I invite you all to verify the schedule, to take a look at the conferences of the next days, and you can well, feel free to watch them and to participate. Today is just the first day. And well, once again, thank you, Dr. Danielle, and hopefully we will meet again soon, virtually or not.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been my pleasure. And I wish you luck on the rest of the symposium.
Thank you. Thank you so very much. So good evening to you all. And thank you once again.